Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It will come as no surprise to you that I am Stacy Wallach, and I'm teaching today the 4th class on this course on Eisenhower's presidency. I have slightly shortened my presentation today, only slightly, to give you lots of time at the end, because the subjects that we're talking about today, even 60 years later, are controversial and raise passions, and to some degree are less than fully settled in terms of what's fact and what's not. However, I never let those kinds of ambiguities get in the way, and I'm going to just go crashing right through. But if you'll recall, the subtitle of the course about Eisenhower is Successful President or Moral Failure. And although I don't use the word morality a great deal in the formal part of the lecture, that's what today's class is all about. Yes, there were legal issues, there were political issues, there were issues of national security, all very legitimate. But ultimately, from the point of view of Eisenhower as president, in my view, ultimately underlying it all, it was a moral issue. And you will see that I have a point of view. If you watch and listen closely, you may discern that I have more than one point of view. But I've never let a minor contradiction here or there slow me down. I'm going to recommend a book. Professor Ellen Schrecker wrote a book in 1998 called Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America. I'm almost positive she's put out a later edition after 2000 to take account of some of the facts that came out when the Russians, following the fall of the Soviet Union, for a few years opened up their archives to scholarly research. Besides being a brilliant scholar, she's a terrific writer. Many of the Crimes, Professor Ellen Schrecker, you will not regret it. Now, one reviewer called her, she is the dean, the American dean of McCarthyism as a scholarly subject. And one reviewer said that this book is thorough, balanced, fair, nuanced, and sophisticated. I have no hesitation in telling you I am none of those things. But I am going full speed ahead. Damn the torpedoes. Now, in studying McCarthyism, and of course I'm focusing on the word McCarthyism as opposed to the single human being, Senator Joseph McCarthy, it's critical to distinguish between exactly what you mean. And later on I'm going to suggest a definition, and Joe McCarthy suggested a definition, but we'll get to that. So one aspect that people often use to include in McCarthyism are Communist Party members who joined for nonviolent, idealistic, political, or social reasons, especially in the 1930s when it was all the vogue. In the midst of the Great Depression, the crash of the banks, the enormous unemployment, fascist Germany having full employment within a couple of years after Hitler came to power, many people got very disillusioned with our system, and joining the Communist Party was either an ideological, acceptable thing, and then for many people it was a social thing. You know, all their friends were doing it, so they did it too. They ignored, at least for a while, the fact that the Constitution, the written Constitution of the Communist Party USA, said that it was both necessary and inevitable that the government in the United States would be overthrown by violence. I guess that was in the fine print. Of course, you could say, well, of course, that's how the United States was formed in the first place. But we're going to pass right over that. And nonetheless, a lot of those folks fell by the wayside the morning after they woke up to headlines that Hitler and Stalin had signed a treaty of friendship a month, what was it, a month or 2 weeks before Germany invaded Poland. The few who didn't leave for that reason when the treaty was announced left a few weeks later when it became clear that it wasn't a treaty of peace and friendship. It was a treaty that provided for Nazi Germany to invade Poland from the west and Russia, I should say the Soviet Union, to invade Poland from the east. Each grabbed their piece, and it was a lot harder to stay in the Communist Party for social or political reasons. There were people who did, plenty of people. But the peak of Communist Party membership in the United States, just before those events in 1939, has been estimated, and it's a very iffy estimate, but it gives you a ballpark of 75,000. And clearly at least a third of its membership fell away by the time the United States entered the war on December 7th. Well, actually, on
those are registered party members.
Right. Thank you. So we also have to distinguish a very different group. American citizens who secretly worked as spies for the Soviet Union's GRU, that's the military spy agency of the Soviet Union, or the NKVD, that's the equivalent of what we now call our CIA. That's a whole different group. Some of those people were members of the Communist Party, and that's how they got to be spies for the Soviet Union. But many of them were not, and the GRU or the NKVD would certainly advise them against joining the party because they wanted to keep them undercover. Then there's Americans whose job it was to discover and prosecute Soviet spies, whether they're American or foreign. I emphasize that, you know, if you work for the FBI, that's part of your job. If you're assigned to find spies, that's your work. Then there's Senator Joseph McCarthy. He was not actually elected by the people of Wisconsin for the specific purpose of finding communists in the United States. That was a self-assigned task. And then there's McCarthyism. And I'm going to try to define for you what I think McCarthyism is all about. But as I say, you'll have ample opportunity to tell me how wrong I am later on in the lecture. So I just want to get across that this is one of those areas where being careful about what you're talking about is worthwhile. You know, this is no minor matter. And for a full generation of Americans, this was no minor matter. Now, we have many sources of information about Soviet spying against the United States, but in my preparation for today's class, I've focused on a few, some of which, of course, will be totally familiar to you, some of which I'm not sure how familiar you are. There were Soviet citizens who were spies, but defected either to the United States or to Great Britain, and they brought, on occasion, a treasure trove of information about what was going on inside the Soviet Union, and in particular, the activities of the Soviet Union spies. So those folks, you know, were giving raw data of which they had firsthand knowledge. And then there were some American citizens who became Soviet spies, but then changed their mind and either voluntarily went to the FBI or were caught and confessed. And there were some critical ones who gave enormous insight into what was happening. Then there were the intercepts of the Venona cables, which I'm going to get to in just a second, in case, just raise your hand if you've never heard of the Venona cables. Ah, never?
Never.
Oh my goodness! Oh my, oh my goodness gracious! Well, that's a little startling. And then, most importantly, because you'll see that by the nature of these three things, I guess, there was always some real ambiguity and confusion. When, after the Soviet Union dissolved, there was a period of less than 10 years, when the Soviets when the Russians opened the Soviet archives to scholarly investigation. Not 100%. It was a brief period. The Soviet files are gargantuan. Some scholars were favored over others. Nobody has an overview of it, not at all. They were just pieces that were looked at by particular historians. And then along came Putin and shut it down. Surprise, surprise. So these are substantial, but by their very nature, they're incomplete. And you have to keep that in mind when people make flat statements about this happened and that happened and this is the guy who did it and she was there and he wasn't. Because as you'll see as we go forward, nothing is all that certain. So let's talk about the Venona files. February 1, 1943, this lady, who should get the Congressional Medal of Honor, except I'm pretty sure she's no longer with us, who was in the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service, started to intercept radio transmissions by the Soviet Military Intelligence Authority to their units, mostly in Europe. They were encrypted, and they were encrypted using the one-pad system. Anybody know what the one? All right, there's a man who knows the one pad. If there's one guy who knows, I don't have to explain it to the rest of you. And essentially, even today, the one-pad system, if used properly, is close to unbreakable. It's hard to use it properly, but if you do, if you have the people in your organization have the right training and discipline, it's an encryption system that's either close to unbreakable or absolutely unbreakable. What happened was that some Soviet military people, for reasons that nobody knows and nobody will ever know, got either lazy or careless or somehow used the same page of a pad more than once. And although I don't understand completely why it is and how it is, the fact that they used the same piece of the code more than once allowed this lady to realize that there might be a possibility that these coded cables could be broken. Here's a picture of the SIS at work. You'll see it's mostly young women. And look at these. This is not a luxurious accommodation. My 1867 grade school that I went to was better equipped than this. And these people were doing some of the most important work in World War II. And we'll focus on him in a moment. Meredith Gardner. On December 20, Meredith Gardner made the first big break into the encrypted cables. He figured out how to break the code. And you can see they'd been collecting them and working on them for 3 years by that time. And one of the first set of cables that they were able to decode revealed that there were Soviet agents down in Los Alamos where the Manhattan Project was creating the first bombs. Later, decoded cables revealed American citizens working as Soviet spies in the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, and the White House. And while people argue to this day about the exact identity of these folks, because the Soviets quite naturally used cover names and changed the cover names frequently. There can be no doubt, once you read the cables, you will have no doubt that there were in fact Soviet spies in all of these departments of the federal government, and some of them were very senior. It took SIS more than 8 years. They stopped doing it on a massive, sort of urgent, emergent basis after 8 years. But some of the work of the decoding from time to time continued for 35 years more. And even the amount of work that they did, which was massive, has only decoded a relatively small portion of these cables, because it takes a huge amount of work to break the code. This is before large-scale computers were available. No, I mean, you're not going to be surprised by that. This was painstaking work. And so I'll repeat again, the Venona cables are dispositive of a number of things. But their biggest drawback was that they were fragmentary in terms of the decoding. Only a portion of the cables were decoded. And some of them, because of the confusion about who was who and the cover names that were used, are ambiguous. So that as stunning and critically important as the information gained from the cables was, and is, none were ever used in criminal prosecutions against the Soviet American spies uncovered. Also because the government didn't want to reveal that they had broken these codes. I think they held that view far longer than was necessary, but you're going to see in a moment just how intense the feeling at the top of the two agencies, the FBI and the Army Signal and Intelligence Service, was that these had to be kept incredibly secret, and that the distribution had to be very limited. And indeed, even within the senior ranks of the American government, the distribution was concealed vis-a-vis the source. They didn't go running to some guy in the Treasury Department and say, hey, look, this is what we just learned this morning from the Venona cables. The phrase Venona cables did not pass the lips of the people who were distributing this material to the few at the top of our government who had a need to see.
Where did the name Venona come from?
It was a completely made-up word, a nonsense word that had no meaning, and that's why they chose it. Here's Meredith Gardner. He should have gotten the Congressional Medal of Honor. A genius. I wish I could find out what happened to him. I hope he had a long and happy and prosperous life. But he seems, I'm sure that serious historians know where he went and what happened to him, but I couldn't find anything on him. Now, this is one of the saddest parts of the story. They brought in this fellow, Bob Lamphere from the FBI, who did a brilliant job. Brilliant. He put together a very small team of FBI agents to analyze the data, the intercepted cables, and figure out what they meant, what was important, who should get what material. I mean, you're talking about a brilliant piece of work by Mr. Lamphere. And this guy should have been put up in front of a wall and shot. He was working in a fairly low-level position in the SIS. He was a sergeant in the Army, and he was a traitor. He alerted his Soviet contact that the Americans had broken the code. And so the Soviets naturally changed the whole coding system, the whole encryption system that they used, and so there are no cables to intercept after 1947. Of course, as you all know, as the years and the decades passed, we found other ways to intercept and decode things. But this chapter, in terms of intercepting new cables, came to an end, although the process of decoding and interpreting them went on, as I said, for years and years and years. He served a brief prison sentence, and then I believe he was traded back to the Russians for somebody. But he was an American citizen. He had no, it wasn't like he was born in Russia and then emigrated here or something like that, which is true of a number of the spies that we'll see. But this fellow was born and bred American who sold out. General Marv Bradley, who was not the Army Chief of Staff yet, after all these cables started coming in 43, 44, 45, 46, but he was high enough up so that the SIS reported to him. He decided not to tell Roosevelt or Truman about the Venona intercepts. He didn't tell he didn't tell Roosevelt because despite Roosevelt's many great strengths, keeping secrets was not one of them. It was, I mean, nobody argued that Roosevelt could keep a secret. He couldn't. But equally importantly, and the reason that Bradley decided not to tell him anything about Venona was that started to become clear that there were people in the White House being named in these cables as Soviet agents. And Bradley didn't know who was going to get this information. And so he decided that the best thing was not to say anything. And that if there was actionable material, they would find a way to act on it without involving Roosevelt. Truman was a little different. By the time Truman was in office, they never told him that there were these cables that were being intercepted. What they told him in his daily or weekly briefings, simply that the FBI has learned that A or B or C. And the source, unnamed and carefully disguised, was in fact the Venona intercepts. The problem was, here's Eisenhower swearing in Bradley as his successor as Chief of Staff. Truman's very happy to see Bradley. Bradley was both extraordinarily competent and very well liked. But the problem with transmitting this data to Truman was that he thoroughly distrusted FBI's J. Edgar Hoover. Totally distrusted him, and with good reason. And therefore, he was very slow to react when he was told, well, Hoover is reporting this or that about spies in the White House or spies. To him, this is just, to Truman that is, this was just classic Hoover smearing innocent people. Yes?
Did somebody say that it came from Hoover, or he just assumed it came?
Yes, what they told him was that it came from FBI intelligence sources, period. Right? So it was a problem. It was a real problem. Yes, sir?
Anytime that term from FBI sources was used, it was known that it was something Hoover wanted to disseminate.
Yes, when you talk to the President of the United States at a weekly intelligence briefing, first of all, Hoover himself might be in the room, but second of all, if you said the FBI is reporting that, that meant it came through Hoover. He was an immensely organized and disciplined guy up until the very end of his life, who made sure that the channel between his organization and the White House went through him. By the way, in another director, you might find that very admirable, that he would be that disciplined and in control of the information flow. What the decoded Venona intercepts ultimately revealed, taken as a whole, when you looked at the whole overview that you gain from reading cable after cable after cable, was a massive Soviet effort to penetrate the United States government from 1930 to 1950. And the only word for it is massive. And it's hard to know, since 1930 to 1950 is a period when Stalin ruled, it's hard to know exactly what he had in mind, why he was doing this. You can think of several different motivations, and perhaps it was all of those. I've chosen this photograph of Mr. Ova Kinion, not because he was the most important. When I use the word massive, you know, you're talking about thousands of Soviet apparatchiks working on this. But because he's one of the few people that we have a photograph of. So this is a passport photograph from when he was a good deal younger and traveling in Europe. I can virtually guarantee you, this is my speculation, that once he achieved a certain level in the NKVD, number one, he didn't go outside of the Soviet Union, and number two, nobody took photographs at all. So this is kind of a historical anomaly to see someone who ultimately got this high up in the Soviet intelligence services. Now we come to Whittaker Chambers, and you remember the various different kinds of sources. One of them was Americans who became imbued with communism and then either changed their mind or were arrested. And he left the Communist Party when Stalin and Hitler signed their 1939 pact. And he felt a little guilty about it, actually. And he talked to a friend who was a reporter, and the friend persuaded him to go to the FBI. And the FBI interviewed him 3 times and just didn't do anything about it. And his information was pretty specific. Now, as it turned out, I'm going to give you a little advance warning on this. In addition to having a lot of very specific information, he was a congenital liar. How do I know he was a congenital liar? Because he got on the witness stand in a trial in New York City and admitted under oath that he lies repeatedly, and that in prior trials he lied under oath. So you don't have to take my word for it. He characterizes himself as a congenital liar. But and he might have been lying about that. He might have been lying about that. It's a perfect example, though, and this son of a gun really epitomizes why all of the material that I'm going to be showing you has to be treated with kid gloves, and you have to keep a very skeptical mind to this because of guys like this. Maybe the FBI was slow to act because we were right in the middle of the Great Patriotic War, and believe me, the senior members of the Roosevelt administration knew that most of the fighting was being done by the Soviets. Most of the dying was being done by the Soviets, and they were not displeased with that. Right? Let's not forget who fought 2/3 of World War II from our side. It was the Soviets. This has nothing to do whether you like the Soviets, you dislike them. It has nothing to do with that. It's just who was fighting the big battles, who was dying by the millions. And as a result, who was battering the German military into submission so that we suffered fewer casualties. Believe me, if you or your brother or your father or whoever hit Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944 and got your head blown off, the fact that the Russians had more heads blown off was no help. It was, believe me, we had plenty of troops who were either wounded or killed. But if you just go by numbers, the overwhelming bulk of the battles and the deaths and the casualties against the German military machine were suffered by the Soviets. But ultimately, the real problem with this guy, despite the fact that he was ultimately proven correct in an awful lot of what he said by this later material, was you took one look at him and you knew this guy was nobody, that you would not rely on him to save your soul.
Didn't they use that same phrase to get...
And here's Alger Hiss. Here's Alger Hiss.
Oh, boy.
And what you have to understand about Alger was
I bet it can.
his mother was from a very old Maryland family that traced itself way, way back. Johns Hopkins University, Phi Beta Kappa, Harvard Law School, law clerk to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, senior State Department official during World War II, enormously admired and respected by all who knew him, and liked, an incredibly likable human being who did an enormous amount of good work for the United States government in a variety of senior posts that he held before he went to the State Department. And people who knew him for a long time were devoted to him, absolutely devoted to him. He seemed like the best that America can produce. Chambers accused Hiss of being a communist in the 30s. Hiss denied it. It never got to the point where the federal government felt comfortable bringing a criminal prosecution against Hiss. But at Hiss's invitation, Chambers made these accusations, I think, on the radio, and Hiss sued him for libel. Both testified under oath. The case never really had a clear-cut answer. And then further evidence was discovered, and the federal government brought a criminal case against Mr. Hiss for perjury. He was never accused of espionage. He was never accused of treason. In fact, by the time they brought the perjury trial against him, the statute of limitations on espionage and perjury had run. But it was a huge trial, a huge trial. The first trial ended in a mistrial. The second trial, Hiss was convicted. A dear friend of his, who I just discovered a week or two ago when I was preparing this, who I actually knew as a fellow lawyer in the 80s. I never knew this. A dear friend of his, Helen Buttonwieser, said that the only time in her whole life, and she was a friend of his for most of his adult life, when she ever saw Alger Hiss totally surprised and speechless, was when the jury came back and the foreman stood up and said, guilty. He had convinced himself that he was innocent. And what he was found guilty of was lying under oath in the previous trial when they said, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And he said, no. His conviction tore apart the entire Eastern liberal establishment, Democrats and Republicans alike. He was widely known. He had practiced law in New York. He was a widely known figure both inside and outside the government. Everybody loved him. And he was enormously intelligent and competent and amiable. And it was incredibly confusing when the American public looked at this schmedre and then looked at him and they said, wait a minute, how can this be? They couldn't, the American public, and I sympathize with this, had a great deal of trouble understanding how a guy who was enormously successful, had had every advantage that America has to offer, could be a traitor. Particularly because they didn't understand that in the 30s, many progressive-minded people who were under the age of 30 joined the party because the American system appeared to be crashing about their shoulders. And the notion that you could be a member of the American Communist Party and not be a traitor, that didn't wash with the American public by the time this all happened in 1949 and 1950. The trial started.
There was the Spanish Civil War where a lot of Americans fought against Franco.
Sure.
Fighting alongside the communists.
Absolutely, good point. Absolutely. Did everybody hear that?
No.
Okay. Moving right along. What Bob said is that in the Spanish Civil War in 36, 37, 38, many progressive American young people went to fight on the side of the Spanish Republic against Franco and the fascist rebellion. The Russians came, the Soviets, forgive me, the Soviets came in on the Republican side with these progressive Americans, and of course the Germans came in on Franco's side, and and the communists had brigades of fighters, and they were the progressive force. Look, the CIA, you all know the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The Congress of Industrial Organizations was founded and grew in part through the efforts of members of the Communist Party USA. They were among the leaders of the progressive labor movement. It was difficult in the 30s for a lot of people, especially intellectuals, to separate out all the different strands of what's liberal, what's progressive, what's socialist, what's communist, and what's traitorous. That was not an easy set of definitions for people to understand. Yes, sir?
Just to go back, that Hiss was convicted of perjury. That's a little like Oscar Wilde, who also was convicted of perjury.
Yes.
That's the original crime. I'm not equating the two.
Thank you very much. Because, my dear sir, other than that one point,
Yes,
which
yeah.
you're absolutely right about, there is no comparison. This is a very important lady whose name has been forgotten. Elizabeth Bentley was a Soviet spy, a major league Soviet spy. And part of her job for a number of years was acting as the courier between all the different Soviet cells and sorting out who's saying what, who's doing what, getting the info back to Moscow, getting instructions from Moscow back. I mean, this lady knew everything there was to know, despite the fact that in general, the Soviets tried to keep their cells separate from each other. But she was a common thread. Yes, ma'am?
Whatever happened to Alger Hiss? How was he sentenced?
He went to jail.
For how long?
He went to jail. He was sentenced to, he was sentenced to 10 years. He served more than 5, but less than 10. He was released and became a salesman in Manhattan for a stationery company, an office supplies company. He wrote a memoir in the late 60s or early 70s, which is a fascinating memoir except for one point. He insists that he's innocent.
Oh, I wonder.
When he was 93 years old, shortly before his death, he admitted that he was a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s. He did not consider himself a traitor. He did not feel that he was guilty of espionage, but he admitted that he had been a member of the party, and that in fact, that's where Fat Face there, what's his name? That's where Whittaker Chambers met him. Forgive me, I should be so much more restrained.
Alger Hiss's son, Tony, does a great deal of writing. I don't know if he still does, but he used to do an enormous amount of writing about his father, particularly in the New Yorker. And you can just look it up, you know.
Good point. So let me just repeat that. Alger Hiss's son, Tony Hiss, does writing in the New Yorker magazine.
Yeah, or.
So, and he writes about his father.
I don't know if he's still writing, but he used to.
So this lady, Elizabeth Bentley, who had just a critical mass of knowledge about Soviet spying in the United States, comes to the FBI and confesses. And she names 150 Americans spying for the Soviets, 37 working in the federal government, some in high office. The funniest thing about this picture, which was taken in the mid to late 40s, I think the late 40s, is this is what she looked like when she became a witness at some trials. The New York Post, my favorite newspaper, had a banner headline when, after the first day of her testimony, "Blonde bombshell reveals all." So, Hoover, who now is directly involved in analyzing the information that Bentley is giving, realizes, just as with the Venona cables, this has to be kept unbelievably secret and limited. He puts a very small group of FBI senior personnel together to deal with the information and decide what's actionable and what's not. Incredibly limited, kept hugely secret, but because some of it involved people in Great Britain or where Great Britain's secret agencies could reach, he decides to tell one person only outside of his own organization. And unfortunately, Sir William Stevenson, the chief of British MI6, decides he has to tell one person, and he tells his second in command, Kim Philby. That was unfortunate, since Kim Philby was a Soviet spy and was in line to succeed Stevenson. And if you read John le Carré's book, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, this fellow is what Carré modeled Bill Hayden on. If you have not read the book or seen the movie, please leave the room now. Go read the book. This is a waste of time for you. Read the book. It's fabulous. And interestingly enough, at least my experience was, even after reading the book and then seeing the movie, I thought the movie was fabulous. It's just a fabulous, fabulous thing. This guy may be close to the most amazing spy of all time. There's a few vying for that, because unlike some others who were brilliant psychopaths, brilliant, but psychopaths, this guy exhibited none of those qualities. An amazingly mature, balanced, brilliant guy. Again, the best that England had to offer. And it's, you know, even after reading a half a dozen John le Carré novels in which le Carré is struggling with this issue, I'm still confused. He was the most senior of the Cambridge Five. Philby, Guy Burgess down here in the lower left, John Cairncross, who wasn't discovered for a long time, Donald McLean, and the guy who recruited them all, and the most mysteriously motivated one of all, Anthony Blunt. His career as an art historian, an art critic, and an art curator led him ultimately to become the curator of the Queen's Own collection. And by the Queen's Own collection, I mean Queen Elizabeth's personal art collection. And they discovered him as the fifth man after a while, but kept it secret for 30 years, because by that time he was no longer operative, and they didn't want to embarrass the Queen. He never suffered for being a traitor. These two guys, Burgess and McLean, escaped thanks to Philby directly intervening and lived out their lives in the Soviet Union. The two of them none too happily. Philby did better. Philby stayed in place after these guys, these two, Burgess and McLean, escaped and managed to avoid detection a little while longer. And then, because he was so high up, understood when they were closing in on him. And he escaped to the Soviet Union as well, where they gave him the award Hero of the Soviet Union. And I think he became a major general in the military. And he just lived out a very pleasant life until the end of his life. Really, nobody in the public at large knew that he was a traitor. Cairncross is the least known of them. Klaus Fuchs was born in East Germany, came to England, became a naturalized citizen, was a truly brilliant physicist. Nobody quarrels with that. So brilliant that he was assigned to the Manhattan Project, the development of the atom bomb during World War II at Los Alamos. And he was a Soviet spy. It's that simple. And if you want to know how and why the Russians, again, I apologize, the Soviets, were able to develop their atomic bombs so quickly, you are looking at the reason for it. Because unlike some others who were trying to penetrate Los Alamos, this guy was creating the atom bomb. He was both a theoretical physicist and a practical scientist/engineer who was involved with all aspects of the work. Some say, I have read this, I don't know that it's true, that his work on the proximity fuse that detonated one of the two bombs that were dropped on Japan ultimately led to the development of the fuse that made the air-to-air missile with which the Soviets shot down Gary Powers' U-2. Who knows? Do you think you could have a scientist engineer lay it all out for me and explain it, and I wouldn't know what they were talking about? But that's what they say. More importantly, he was exchanged for someone, Rudolf Abel, somebody we captured, that the Russians wanted back. He went one way, came back the other way. This guy is such a sweetie. And he really never suffered for being a traitor. These people suffered. And there can be no doubt that, let me just see what the next slide is. Yeah. There can be no doubt that Julius Rosenberg was a Soviet spy. His two children finally wrote a book saying, yeah, he was a Soviet spy.
They knew.
The children did not know. The children fought for years to establish their parents' innocence. But when the Soviet archives were opened up in the late 90s, one of the first places that American historians went looking was to see what the Russians said about the Rosenbergs. There cannot be the slightest doubt that Julius was a spy. And what he was doing, and nobody knows for sure if what I'm about to show you is the only part of what he was doing. It's quite possible that he was doing other things as well. But he passed on to the Soviets crude bomb drawings, atomic bomb drawings, that Ethel's brother, may he rot in hell, made while working in a very junior capacity. I think he was a sergeant in the Army and had a very low-level job, but it gave him access to a lot of things. And this was the intermediary, the cutout. Harry Gold was a Communist Party member, a New Yorker. So it went from green glass to gold to Julius Rosenberg. What isn't so clear is Ethel's involvement. That's not to say that she was innocent. It's just unclear. And there is a large body of historical writing suggesting that everything that David, who testified against his sister and brother-in-law, that what he was really doing was attributing everything that his own wife did to Ethel to save his own wife's life. I am not about to comment on that. Those are questions like if both of your kids were out in the surf drowning and you could only save one, which one would you save? Well, the only thing in that conundrum that I'm sure of is that I would save one of them. I would not be paralyzed into inaction by the horror of the choice. You may have seen a movie involving a young woman named Sophie. These are horrible things.
David Greenblatt wrote a book just a couple of years ago. I've heard him interviewed as he stepped.
Yeah, he made a career out of it.
Yeah, I think he's still alive.
He's a bum.
But he's
You're
still
right.
alive.
Yeah. The children, by the way, came out amazingly well, just amazingly well. Ethel, for whatever reason, preferred execution to confession, leaving her two small sons, initially as homeless orphans. They were finally adopted by a non-family couple named Mirrorball, M-W-E-R-O-P-O-L, who were progressives, not communists, progressives. And the only parallel I can think of offhand is the couple who adopted the football player Oher, O-H-E-R. If you read Michael Lewis's The Blind Side, you'll see a similarly motivated couple who put their actions where their mouth was. My mother was the same age as Ethel and raised in the same place with a very similar demographic, socioeconomic background. Very, very similar. My mother was devastated by this whole thing, not least because the Rosenbergs were obviously Jewish. And she was absolutely convinced of Ethel's guilt because of this. I raise it as a question, a badge of innocence or a fanatical devotion to the Soviet communist cause. And my words are, no one will ever know for sure. My mother had no doubt. A woman who would leave her two small children motherless was guilty as sin. It's the only explanation that made any sense to my mother. Yes?
The Mirrorball Boys live in Springfield. The oldest one is a lawyer who runs a non-profit to help children. So they're both still around.
Absolutely.
It's all behind them. I mean,
They're my age. I'll go one step further. I went to school with Mike Mirrorball. Of course, I didn't know that he was anybody except Michael Mirrorball. And Michael was a year ahead of me, and Rob is 2 years behind me. Very nice, very nice. They've made a real life for themselves, and they have dealt in a very mature way with the discovery that their father, for sure, was a Soviet spy. Yes?
Their father, the man who adopted them, is the one who wrote the music, Strange Fruit.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
So
Isn't that interesting? Yes. Yes.
2 weeks ago, I saw a very good movie, Daniel, that's based on E.L. Doctorow's book. Daniel being the son, and it shows him growing up.
Right.
It also has flashbacks showing the parents.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book, but the movie was very good.
The movie is better than the book.
Oh, yeah?
I'm a big E.L. Doctorow fan, and there are sections of the book that are fabulous because he really tries to get inside the minds and hearts and emotions of these people. But it's just overall, it's just kind of long and tedious. The movie, I agree with you, it's fabulous. But we got to keep moving. So if you want to take my point of view, we'll never know for sure. If you want to go by my mother, who has a little better angle of attack here. You know, she grew up under remarkably similar circumstances at exactly the same time in the same place, and this, her willingness to die. By the way, there's no real doubt that she was indicted to pressure her husband Julius into confessing. The evidence against her that was presented at the trial was very weak, even by the standards of the time. And they were sure that sooner or later she would crack, or that her husband would confess to save her life. When they were in Sing Sing waiting to be executed, they kept an open telephone line to the Attorney General, and through the Attorney General to President Eisenhower, hoping that at the last second she would confess. She didn't. She stayed silent, as did Julius, and they were both executed. The execution, of course, occurred during Eisenhower's presidency, but all of the events and the trial and the sentencing had all occurred during Truman's administration. Here are the Soviet handlers, not only for Rosenberg, but for many others. And again, I'm showing it to you just because you don't often get to see spies like this. He was the undercover field agent who actually handled Rosenberg and other spies. This was his boss. Again, it's a passport photo, so he looks a lot younger, but the photograph was taken when he first came and got his passport. So you have to think of him as a good deal older by the time these events occurred. But he was by the time he became the consul general in New York City, he was a very senior player. And here are 6 out of dozens and dozens of people who were revealed as Soviet spies, or, now here's an important distinction, either actual Soviet spies working actively for the Soviets with full understanding that they were traitors to their country, or, note this, as knowing sources of classified information intentionally passed to the Soviets, but by people who didn't believe that doing that was being traitorous. People who, remember, they had been our biggest ally in World War II. If you came out of the 30s as a sympathizer who wasn't put off by the Hitler-Stalin pact, they seemed, the progressive society. If you really, blinded yourself to 90% of what was going on. And there were people who blinded themselves. How about the show trials that Stalin put on during the 1930s, where, he took obviously innocent people and had them shot and first put them on trial. It's hard to get past that. But some of these people worked very hard at it. So who are these folks? Harry Dexter White, a very senior official in the Treasury Department who had an enormous influence on government policy. Whether you believe in his innocence or are convinced of his guilt, if you look at the record, this guy is enormously powerful and influential in Franklin Roosevelt's government. And passed enormous amounts of sensitive information to the Soviets. Named first in the Venona cables, and then because they were not 100% sure that they had all the cover names uncovered correctly, they went into the Soviet files in the late 90s, and there he was. Laughlin Curry, a direct, immediate White House aide to FDR. And you think Omar Bradley and J. Edgar Hoover were a little nervous about telling FDR about the Venona cables? Darn right they were. name like this pops up. You know, that's like, his name isn't very well known today, but it's like if you said Petraeus or Brzezinski or Kissinger, you know, is in the White House passing secrets to the Soviets. In fact, as we know, they had other things that they were busy with. But this was a devastating piece of information for the senior intelligence community to discover. How about this? A senior OSS agent. And I don't mean some guy on the ground. I mean a senior guy who worked directly with Wild Bill Donovan in setting up the OSS and running it. Whew. This guy, this is not a very flattering photograph. They caught him at a bad moment. You know, there's probably bad photographs of, you know, almost anybody around. You can tell, by the way, who the New York Times approves of by the photograph that they put on the front page. The open-mouthed ones, you know. He had enormous access to our most secret manufacturing and production data, and he passed it all on. Here's Victor Perlo, who actually ran a group, chief of the aviation section of the War Production Board. He knew everything there was to know, and he passed it all on to the Soviets. He had a whole group of people that he recruited. It was called, in the U.S. intelligence files, it's referred to as the Perlo Group. And then there's the Silvermaster Group, which is probably the most famous. Here's Mr. Silvermaster. He was a senior official at the War Production Board, and they might as well have put the Soviet Army Chief of Staff inside the Treasury Department. I mean, the stuff went directly from the War Production Board to the Soviet Union. A total and complete penetration.
How many of these 6 were ever prosecuted?
Not one.
Is it possible that the early days of the Venona project was just a huge deception to make Americans suspicious of each other?
I wish it were
Created
true.
by the Russians?
I wish it were true, but it's
Well,
not.
how do we know if it is or not?
Well, number one, because the minute that sergeant passed on the information that the codes had been broken, they changed the codes. Number two, that's what they did when they went into the Soviet archives in the late 90s. And you're looking at raw Soviet intelligence archives, and it's all there. I wish you were right, but it's just not so. And indeed, there's a whole generation of people who are so committed to the notion that it's not so, that you could show them the cables and you could show them the archives, and they would look you in the eye and say, it can't be true. It can't be. But what's interesting, given what we're about to see, is that by 1952, by November of 52, when Eisenhower is elected, most of this was history. The FBI did a pretty good job of, in fact, I have to say, I hate to admit this, but Hoover's FBI did a very good job of eliminating these people, getting them out of the government, or getting them out of the country, or getting them rendered inoperative in some way. For example, Harry Dexter White started to be questioned by the FBI and had a heart attack. So they let him go home. He had a second heart attack and died, the day after. The official cause of death, interestingly enough, for those of you more conspiracy-minded folks, is listed on his death certificate not as a heart attack, but as an overdose of digitalis. Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a difference between a death by heart attack and an overdose of digitalis? I don't believe there is.
But it looked the same.
He had a history of coronary problems.
Well, he had had a heart attack a few days before. But the important point here is by the early 50s, it was all over, essentially. not 100% over, but say 85% over. But that didn't slow down a certain individual. Now here is me talking. This rational, fact-based fear of Soviet subversion inside the United States combined, that is, mixed with their domination of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union's imposition of communist governments across Eastern Europe, which was still a big shock to the American people. The American people thought we won the Second World War. The communist defeat of Chiang Kai-shek's pro-Western government and Mao's takeover of China. We lost China. Where did it go? The scariest thing of all, in 49, 50, 51, the development by the Soviets of a functional atomic bomb. And all of this, understandably, led to a degree of U.S. public hysteria. You can call it another word. Fear, upset. You can decide for yourself. And most of all, the public's inability to distinguish between communist spies and subversion on the one hand, and anyone who criticized the public policies and actions of the United States government on the other hand. A problem that has lived with us to this very day. But we have to acknowledge that the post-World War II period was a truly scary time for many Americans. Yet we've got to keep in mind, given what I'm about to show you, that the worst was over by the time Ike took office in January of '53. We were about to experience 8 years of peace and prosperity. All right? 8 years of peace and prosperity. But it was scary. When you survive a world war and subversion and atomic bombs and on top of that the Korean War, you don't get over that overnight. The fact that Ike gets elected and announces that we're going to have peace in our time and prosperity for all, you don't forget overnight what you've been through. In 1949, 1950, the famous, but I bet you there's at least one or two people who have not heard of this, the famous Foley Square trials of the Communist Party leadership occurred. These are the, is it 10? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 guys. One guy got sick. A guy named Foster got sick and was never tried. It's useful. You get sick, you don't get, well, whatever. What particularly rubs me the wrong way, because these guys were not my favorite guys, is this. Oh, you want to defend these guys? Good. Go to jail. I knew the judge. When I was, well, we'll come to that in a moment. When I was working in that courthouse, he was, I think he was 96 years old, sharp as a tack. He had been on the bench, I think, 1.5 years when this trial was assigned to him, which was literally the trial of the mid-century. It was the longest federal criminal trial in history up until that time. And this guy had been Harold Medina, fabulous guy, had been a law professor at Columbia. You know what a little bubble, a little ivory tower that is in those days? And then a year and a half later, he's trying the largest federal criminal trial in the history of the federal courts.
Excuse me, was this a jury trial?
Yes.
So the jury found these people?
Yes. And here, by the way, is the United States Courthouse in Foley Square. Why am I showing you this? Well, that's because that's where I worked for the first year. And I knew you'd want to know that. I knew you'd want to know that. It caused a sensation. It's faded from our collective memories, but it caused a sensation. But the thing I want to get across to you is that by the time Senator McCarthy really got rolling, and we're about to get to him, the Communist Party was decimated. Because not only did they try these guys, these 10, but when they got the sentences and the appeals were affirmed, they then did a series of trials all across the country of the local communist cell leaders. I think over 100 were sent to jail.
Were they convicted simply of being members of the Communist Party?
Yes, I'm about to get to that. Thank you for bringing it up.
Sorry.
But you are correct. One of the things that is most upsetting about these trials, even if you're absolutely clear in your minds that these were bad people who should be punished, is that that's what they were convicted of. There was not a single actual act of subversion or treason or spying that was proven at trial. The government, on purpose, they knew what they were doing, only proved that they were members of the Communist Party USA, and the chief evidence against them, because they all admitted they were members, they were the leadership, was the constitution of the party that said that the purpose of the party is to assist in the necessary and inevitable violent revolution that will overthrow the government. That was their case. And it was upheld all the way to the Supreme Court. And my thought is that if that case was tried today, it wouldn't even get to trial. The indictment would be dismissed as facially insufficient. That's not to say that these guys were nice people. That's not to say that the FBI shouldn't have tried to prove, through their lawyers, actual acts and send them to jail for it. The problem was that the acts that they had evidence of, they didn't want to reveal the sources. All right? That's what this whole thing was about. And their unwillingness to reveal the sources of their intelligence about what some of these guys were actually up to led them to proceed on legal theories that I just don't think stand the light of day. But the jury didn't have a problem with that back then. And I also want to focus on the fact that by 1950-51, just as Senator McCarthy really gets going, the Communist Party in the United States is decimated. But by 1955, the joke, which I always thought was a joke, was that the FBI had so massively penetrated the party with double agents that if they stopped paying dues, the party would collapse financially. It turns out that Hoover himself later said that that was actually true. All right, because by the time these guys, and the second tier trials that followed, because there were over 100 communist leaders of the party at the more state and municipal levels sent to jail later in the years that immediately followed, the membership fell off so dramatically that only the FBI was paying the dues. This is the front of the courthouse only to show you what an enormously controversial trial this was, because most people who had some sense of constitutional law and of limited government were very upset by the trial, not because they were sympathetic with these 10 guys at all. There was zero sympathy for them. But there was real upset at the government's theory of the case, that you could, well, what if you take something that a few of you may be a member of, something like the America-Israel Friendship League, or
The Tea Party.
yeah. You want to be sent to jail for joining an organization?
It's good enough for the communists, it's good enough for the Tea Party.
This was a scene that was replicated many times later as other controversial trials came to be. So here we have Joe McCarthy, who volunteered for the Marines. He was a congressman at the time. He had to get special dispensation to resign as a congressman and join the Marines. But he was a fraud from day one. He just invented his combat record. He never saw combat for 5 minutes. He forged documents and just invented a whole story of his time in the Pacific. This plane is on the ground. He did go on several, quote, combat missions. There was no combat whatsoever. They were milk runs to deliver the mail to another place. But for whatever it's worth, and by the way, You know who gave him the name Tail Gunner Joe? He did. He's a master publicist from day one. At the end of the war, he came back and went back to Congress and then got himself elected senator and was very popular in Wisconsin. There's a side of Joe McCarthy we don't often see when we look back. He was, in his earlier years, a gregarious, amiable, hail fellow well-met who was very, very popular in Wisconsin. And he won the Senate race, against a vigorous campaign by the Democrat. You got to see the bigger picture of Joe, particularly because we're all so familiar with the terrible end he came to. Still, up until February 9, actually February 10, up until February 10, he was a nobody. But on February 9, he gave a speech to the Republican Women's Club of Wheeling, West Virginia, like, in the Grand Central Station or the Madison Square Garden in New York. Right? You can't think of a more obscure place. Well, I can think of one or two. And he actually claimed that there were 205 known communists in the U.S. State Department and held up a piece of paper that was, we don't know for sure because it wasn't filmed, but the odds are that it was a blank piece of paper or his secretary's notes on how to get to the women's club. And it rocketed him to national attention. And for the next 5 years, the media, particularly newspapers, just loved him. Ike decided to ignore McCarthy to avoid giving him more publicity on the theory that sooner or later he would self-destruct. He did not understand that McCarthy was so destructive and that what he was creating, i.e. McCarthyism, separate from the senator himself, was going to go on for years and was extremely destructive. Because the Republicans swept into the majority in the Senate and the House in '52, the Republican leadership got to appoint the chair people, and he was made chairman of the Government Operations Committee, and he made himself chairman of its investigation subcommittee. That's different from the House Un-American Activities Committee. He had nothing to do with that. We'll see that in a moment. And he terrorized witnesses. There's no other word for it. And he was very good at it. And he was particularly good at it because he had almost no facts to back up his accusations. I had the misfortune of dealing with him much later in life. He became a very, very successful lawyer and an extremely powerful power broker. Even when he was calumnied in the press, he would hold a birthday party for himself. Roy Cohen, I'm talking about. He would hold a birthday party for himself every year in Manhattan, and every judge in the city came to kiss his ring, without exception. Republicans and Democrats, and of course they were mostly Democrats, but the Republicans as well. His partner was the Republican power behind the scenes. You were talking about an immensely powerful Democratic leader. Actually, it goes beyond Democrats. Roy Cohen.
Attorney. He was an advisor to McCarthy, wasn't he?
He was his chief counsel. See right here? Chief counsel. But the key is that I'm talking about him later in life. I'm much younger, of course, so we're talking about much later in life. This is a very, very gifted, brilliant individual who had the morals of a cockroach. But here's one that you may not be so quick to describe as a cockroach. McCarthy hired Bob Kennedy right out of law school. I think he had just turned 27 years old to be deputy counsel. But his best hire was J.B. Matthews, who had been the staff director during the war for the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is probably the best quote of the entire course. J.B. Matthews on the Reds and our churches. Quote, the largest single group supporting the communist apparatus in the U.S. is composed of Protestant clergymen. Who could write such a thing? Who could do that? Well, you're all looking at him right here. Right here. And he was unbelievably ubiquitous in his travels around the circles of the federal government, both testifying and researching. And there's a probability that at least some of his so-called research came directly from J. Edgar Hoover. His appointment caused a fire. Oh, surprise! It caused a firestorm. Yes, there were a few, like the American Council of Protestant Clergymen, who were not too excited about this. In fact, virtually every clergyman of any persuasion, of any religion, got upset by this. And what's interesting is not that McCarthy finally fired him. It's that McCarthy fought hard to keep him. All right, that gives you some insight into where McCarthy's head was at. This guy didn't bother McCarthy at all. He wanted him, but he finally had to face the fact that the Senate Republican leadership was not going to tolerate this. And he spent, I'm not going to waste your time, he spent a long time chasing phantom communists in the government. It was all a lot of baloney, but it terrified and terrorized people. But he was coming up with nothing. So in 1954, he decided to go after communists in the United States Army. Now, you got to wonder if his heavy drinking hadn't already started to affect him. And I say that respectfully, because you've got a president of the United States of your own party who spent his entire adult life in the Army. Every single person he went after was a personal friend or colleague of Eisenhower. And you just have to think, you know, and here's Eisenhower, who's being very hands-off about McCarthy, leaving him alone. And it's like he just suddenly decided, well, what's the best way for me to commit political suicide? Why go after the one institution that you're just bound to get the President of the United States up in arms about? Ike never actually spoke out against McCarthy. He did some things behind the scenes, and some recent historians have tried to take these tiny little things he did behind the scenes and blow them up into the famous, fabulous, courageous campaign that Eisenhower waged against McCarthy. It's 100% baloney. 100% baloney. He did nothing. And it's particularly when you compare his nothing stance to a few people who stood up to McCarthy that you realize what a complete zero Eisenhower was on this subject.
But the strategy,
Truman,
his strategy supposedly was don't give him any more
right.
attention than he deserves. Right?
That's like telling a drowning man, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. You know, we're going to grow some rubber trees and make a rubber life preserver, and when it's all ready, we'll fling it out to you.
But didn't he, in fact, McCarthy, that is, self-destruct on TV with his hearing?
Are you going to let me do my little dog and pony show, or what? Finally, when McCarthy got his committee to issue a congressional subpoena for Army personnel files, Eisenhower finally woke up and invoked executive privilege, not my favorite doctrine, and refused to turn over the Army personnel files. As a practical matter, although it took a little while to work out, that ended McCarthy's investigation. The contrast with Truman and his treatment of McCarthy, both while he was president and for 2 decades thereafter, is enormous. Truman consistently excoriated McCarthy and his tactics. And particularly long afterwards, when it was no longer Republican Democratic politics, he repeatedly said in public, this is the worst thing that ever happened to America. The civil liberties is, well, let's put it this way. If you are a true conservative, the first organization you should join is the American Civil Liberties Union. The first organization you should join. Because that's the one organization that no matter who's accused of what, left, right, good, bad, indifferent, they will defend your constitutional rights. They are the classic, traditional American value organization. There are a few conservatives out there who don't quite get my point. But the difference, both when he was president and all during the 1950s, between Truman's stance and Eisenhower's stance is gargantuan. It took an old-fashioned Boston lawyer to publicly confront McCarthy and shame him on television, because the Army McCarthy hearings were televised. And when he said, and I'm about to paraphrase, Senator, at long last, have you no shame, sir? Have you no decency? Well, the short answer was, he didn't. He was eloquent. But take a look at this guy, Edward R. Murrow, part of the entertainment, news, intellectual, Eastern liberal establishment that was under attack by not just McCarthy, but by the whole right-wing anti-communist group. He didn't have any problem in 1954 on his TV show to spend a half hour both playing clips, video clips of McCarthy at work in his investigations, and showing how wild his accusations were, how he terrorized witnesses, how he didn't play fair, and it was enormously influential. He didn't have any lack of courage. He didn't have any doubt in his mind that taking on McCarthy publicly was worth doing. And it actually shifted public opinion because it made plain that you didn't have to be the President of the United States to take on McCarthy and survive. And unfortunately, and I actually mean this sincerely, he was finally censured by his colleagues in '56. I'm talking about McCarthy, mostly because he was entirely disrespectful of his fellow senators. And that's what really got the vote against him. It wasn't so much that they disagreed with McCarthy going against all these so-called communists. What they disagreed was that he didn't play by the Senate rules. He didn't play nice within the gentleman's club that was the Senate of the 40s and 50s. He fell into drink, he fell into obscurity, and by 1958, when I think he was 58 years old, he died of cirrhosis of the liver, alone and unloved. Except there's a group in Wisconsin that to this day honors him as the best senator Wisconsin ever had. But now we talk about McCarthyism, which I'm going to define, you can define it the way you want. The practice of making accusations of disloyalty, subversion, or treason without regard to hard evidence, as well as making unfounded but publicized allegations or using unfair investigative techniques, especially in order, and this is the key to McCarthyism, in order to restrict or suppress dissent or political criticism or unpopular beliefs. And there are a couple of groups I can think of today that can legitimately say that they are the victims of pure, unadulterated McCarthyism. I think it's pretty obvious, at least a couple of them. This is the invention of the word, McCarthyism. This is a Herb Bloch cartoon from 1954. And I don't know if it's clear. These are buckets of tar that McCarthy was throwing. This is the platform, and the Republican elephant is saying, I'm supposed to stand on this platform of tar. And he's not too happy about it. But that's apparently where the word was invented. Joe McCarthy's definition of McCarthyism. McCarthyism is Americanism with its sleeves rolled up. Yes, indeed. Hey, listen. We listen to all points of view in this room. Here's another Herb Bloch cartoon. He was famous for saying, I have here in my hand a list of, and it would always be a different number. It was always a different number. And this is a reference to something that occurred in the Army McCarthy hearings. He was actually caught using a doctored photograph to try to make it. They had one of these group photographs where there was a guy who was a Russian something or other, and there was the secretary of the army or some general, and they took out, and it was some kind of big group thing. I mean, they took out all the people in between, and it looked like the two of them were pals. It was just a photoshopped thing, and he was caught with his. I'm talking about McCarthy. Was caught with his pants down. I'm pretty sure it was Roy Cohn, and then they also faked a letter, forged a letter. They had no limits. This I'm showing you, this is an actual photograph of the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is not McCarthy now. This is the House Un-American Activities Committee. I want you to picture you sitting right here, looking up at the Klieg lights and being grilled. I can tell you that appearing in front of a friendly congressional committee to testify on a totally non-controversial subject is scary. It's scary. So you can imagine,
Yes.
you can just imagine what it's like to be in this kind of maelstrom of publicity and hostile questioning. And this was done really across the country, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, and even in places like New York City at the municipal level. Thousands of people were subpoenaed and put through this terrorizing experience. Here's the guy who ran the House Un-American Activities from 38 to 44 and who really gave it substance. He's actually a very nice guy, and he actually found some communists in the government. But the net effect of his work and his successor as the chair was essentially to terrorize large segments of the American population, because a man or a woman would come back from an experience like that and tell all his or her relatives or friends. They would tell their relatives, and particularly when it was focused on certain industries or certain groups, pretty soon the whole industry or whole group would understand how frightening it is to be called in front of a committee and asked, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Yes, sir.
McCarthyism had a huge effect on the entertainment business.
Huge. We're about to do that.
People were blackballed all over them.
We all knew people.
Of course.
And I used to work at it, and I had to sign a loyalty oath before I could be hired.
And it took an enormous amount of courage, and some would say foolhardiness, not to sign the loyalty oath.
It would get hard.
And it was across the country. That's why McCarthyism is very different from Senator McCarthy. It was a far broader, well, I'm about to show you. Propaganda. Enormous, privately funded right-wing propaganda. And I use the phrase right-wing, maybe I'll take that word back. Anti-communist. Fervent, radical anti-communism among private, moneyed sources could put out stuff like this. They put out movies, they put out TV programs. Remember the program I Led Three Lives? Herbert Philbrick? I mean, this is all propaganda. This was propaganda. The FBI put out its own TV show. I mean, it's unbelievable. I should take that back. It's very believable. Very, very believable. Perhaps the most damaging of all were private publications that employers relied on, accusing people of treason without any factual basis whatsoever. This you should remember for the rest of your lives and tell your children and grandchildren about. You know who put out red channels? A shopping center owner up in Buffalo, New York. And this was unbelievably influential. It went, for example, in the entertainment and film industry and in the advertising business. Employers would get this. They'd look for the names. Oh, that guy? You're fired. It wasn't like, let's come in and talk about it. It's, you're fired. Because if you didn't, somebody would call you up from Red Channels and say, I noticed that Joe Dokes is still on your payroll. I don't think that's wise. And there would be a sense of repercussions. The entire senior moneyed group in Hollywood, the guy, and actually, as some of you may know, the real moneyed group behind the American film industry is all in New York City. It's Allen and Company. That's where the money is. They let these directors do their artistic stuff out in Hollywood. But the money is all in New York, and they call the shots. And they made it crystal clear across the board, with one exception, that the movie industry was going to sign on 100% to loyalty oaths and to getting rid of anybody accused of less than patriotic behavior. You know what the one exception was? Which I cannot explain. I can just report it to you. Universal Pictures.
Why?
I don't know why. This is the most vicious part of McCarthyism. If the federal government subpoenaed you or let's say indicted you, you at least would get the indictment. You could hire a lawyer. You'd go in front of a judge and you could fight it. You'd know what the charge was. Here, you never knew what the charge was. You never knew what the source was. All you knew was that one day you were called in and your boss said, "Joe, thank you for 12 years of excellent work. You're fired." Just like that. A shopping center owner in Buffalo, New York, with that kind of power. That's what McCarthyism is. Forget about the senator. I'm talking about McCarthyism. Anti-communist hysteria led to labeling normal, usual, everyday, run-of-the-mill public health measures as part of the communist conspiracy.
Still is.
It still is.
Other communities are against Florida. One issue was in the 60s.
In my little town of Leominster, Massachusetts, in the late 50s, they wanted to fluoridate the water because Leominster had a particular concentration of tooth decay. They bought, because they understood where the John Birch Society was coming from, the doctors and dentists, and this is directly contrary to the monetary interest of the dentists, the doctors and dentists, and I'm talking, it was 100% of the doctors and dentists practicing in Leominster, Massachusetts, bought full-page ads explaining what fluoridation was, explaining that it was safe, explaining the results that it got where it was put in other parts of the country. And the day before the vote, because the city council was too scared to just pass it, they put it up for a referendum. The day before the vote, the John Birch Society bought a quarter-page ad saying fluoridation is a communist conspiracy, and the vote failed. Fluoridation didn't happen, and I have a mouthful of cavities. But now maybe you understand why I use the word hysteria. Hysteria. This is the most famous part of the McCarthyistic attack on the entertainment industry, the Hollywood 10. It's actually the Hollywood 11. Again, one guy got sick. What can I tell you? They went to jail. It took, actually there were thousands who had their careers destroyed. Nobody knows for sure, but the best estimate is that maybe 10 or 15% after 10 or 15 years were able to rebuild their careers. These were very brave people, very, very brave people. And because they're so brave and because their names are being lost in history, I'm going to show them to you. Alva Bessie, Herbert Bieberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and perhaps the most famous one of all, Dalton Trumbo. But they were the tip of the iceberg. This I'm going to read to you. Insulated, first in the Army, then in the presidency, Ike never understood the enormous damage being done by McCarthyism or his personal ability, if he so chose, to use his enormous prestige and popularity to stop it. And this is what I suggest was his greatest moral failure. Yes, sir.
Going back to your statement earlier when you were talking about J.B. Matthews and his comments about the Protestant clergy, were there any religious groups at all during this time when McCarthyism was in its fervor? Did they ever come out and say anything? That any religious group? I keep thinking, for example, of the time when he reached his pinnacle, there was a Catholic priest in this area that thought he was God.
Well, let me go directly to that. I actually chose not to speak to that. But I will say this. The single strongest supporter of Senator McCarthy at his worst was the Catholic Church. Period. End of story. That's not an attack by me on the Catholic Church. That's just a statement of what occurred in the first half of the 1950s. Every religious group has its ups and its downs. That was not the Catholic Church's best moment in time.
But did any religious group come out
Against him?
against him?
I don't want to answer that without being sure of my facts. So maybe at the next class, if you'll remind me at the beginning, I'll try to give you an answer. It's a sensitive subject. I don't mind talking about it, as you've probably noticed. I'm not worried about sensitivities too much, but I want to get my facts straight. And so if you'll do me the favor of reminding me at the beginning of the next class, I'll try to give you an answer. Eisenhower did make one speech relatively early in his presidency at Dartmouth College in which he denounced book burning. It was a metaphor. He wasn't really referring to bonfires of books, and it was like a flick of an ash in a hurricane. It just vanished. I don't think he was in favor of McCarthy at all. In fact, I think he was disgusted by him. But he didn't understand the underlying morality of what was being attacked here until his own friends in the army were being attacked. Then, he suddenly woke up. But until then, he just said, well, it's not a top priority for you. In fact, it's not a priority for me at all. His non-involvement. If we had more time, I'd ask somebody to stand up and make an argument that it was just smart politics on the part of Eisenhower. Because I as experienced an advocate as I am, having defended some awful people in my time, I can't make that argument. I think it was stupid politics and utterly immoral. But not immoral in the sense that that Eisenhower decided to do something for his own personal benefit. I think he just failed to understand what the issue was and the extent of its impact on the American people. And McCarthyism outlasted the senator by a long, long, long time. And this is where I'll end. So is McCarthyism really dead? Or are there still those eager to exploit fear to achieve their own political or economic ends?